Hi, everybody. So we have for you today a lecture on Plato's Apology. I'm going to actually break things into three different sort of phases here, three different parts of the lecture. The first part, I'll just give some general background information on Plato. Some of this you might already know, some you might not. After that, there's a dialogue that takes place directly before the Apology that kind of sets the table for the Apology that I didn't ask you to read, but that I just want to talk a little bit about because I think it does, will help you to understand a little bit how Socrates responds to his accusers in the Apology and why he responds the way he does. And after we discuss the Euthyphro, we'll discuss the Apology itself. And I'll also talk about some more general information about Socrates, about the Socratic method, his method of argumentation, which you can see in the dialogue very clearly, as well as Socrates' relationship to people called sophists, who were the first sort of professional teachers in Athens. And Socrates and the sophists were sort of enemies of each other. Socrates and the sophists, I think, were all teachers of a kind, but they had a different view of teaching, of how somebody should teach, of why they should teach, etc. And I'll get into that a little bit. And also try to show you a little bit of what things look like today in some of the places that we'll talk about from the lecture, some photographs, as well as some artist renderings of Socrates and some of the other Greek philosophers, as well as what Socrates' trial might have actually looked like. So let me begin by talking a little bit about Plato. It's important to understand, obviously, the relationship between Plato and Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher. There's sort of a chain of influence you can see here. So we have Socrates as Plato's teacher. Plato was then Aristotle's teacher. Aristotle's most famous student was Alexander the Great. So four important names there. Socrates himself didn't write anything down. He really seemed to believe in the importance and value of live discussion and live debate, talking directly with somebody or with a group of people, where you could ask questions of each other, make sure you understood what the other person was saying. Of course, there are all kinds of forms of nonverbal communication as well that you get with live debate and discussion. Plato, in part in honor to his teacher Socrates, uses Socrates essentially as the protagonist or as his mouthpiece in these dialogues that he wrote. I think Plato believed it was important to leave a legacy, a Socrates legacy. It was also increasingly more important as education was becoming more formal to be able to develop things for people to read and discuss and lecture notes, et cetera, as we think of sort of education in the more modern sense. But Plato used Socrates essentially, as I said, as his mouthpiece or as the protagonist in these dialogues. So it might be a little confusing when we talk about them as Plato's dialogues with Socrates as the main speaker. Aristotle had a very different method altogether, which is much more of a textbookish way of writing. His writings were probably much more directly lecture notes that are much more traditional. He's sometimes referred to as the first university type teacher as we would identify him today. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Plato lived between 428 and 348 BC, so several hundred years before the beginning of Christianity as we know it historically. Plato and his followers, Platonists, as they're sometimes called, I think clearly had some kind of an influence on the development of Christianity, on the view of the cosmos, the worldview of in Christianity. Essentially with Christianity, you get this idea that there's a natural kind of inferior world that human beings live in their embodied form, and then there's some heavenly realm somewhere else where we exist in a disembodied form that's a realm of perfection and ultimate beauty, etc., Plato had a kind of similar belief. He believed the everyday world that we live in is inferior. It's in constant change and flux. Nothing exists in a perfect form in our everyday natural world. We're embodied in this everyday natural world, and our bodies are the source of our suffering and our pain, and when we get old and die, et cetera, and our aging. But he did believe there was a realm that he called the realm of the forms, and these forms were kind of blueprints of perfection of everything that exists in an inferior form in our everyday natural world. And ultimately, he believes as in education and in becoming enlightened, we need to be able to kind of intellectually understand, contemplate the realm of the forms, to understand things in their perfect form. We can never achieve perfection here on our everyday earthly world, but if we understand or begin to understand what perfection looks like, we can at least begin to move in that direction. And that's how Plato, I think, really believed that one way that society can improve is by always striving to become better, by having some vision, some idea of what a better world might look like, what perfection might look like. The most famous example of that in Plato's writings is something I teach with my undergraduates in the School of Education called the Republic, which was Plato's vision of an ideal society. Plato was from a relatively wealthy Athenian family, which means he was well educated. And as you might remember from social studies when you're in high school, and certainly as we saw in the dialogue we read for today, for this week, the Apology, when Plato was around 29 to 30 years old, his teacher Socrates was put to death for being a troublemaker. There were a couple main charges against Socrates that Plato portrays in the Apology. Those two, basically, the first one really has to do with this belief that Socrates doesn't believe in the Athenian gods. As it's kind of worded, he's always talking about things down on earth and our earthly existence, as opposed to talking about the gods and revering the gods, etc. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Socrates, I should say, was definitely more of a more down to earth than Plato, who again was always sort of had his eye towards some kind of superior realm somewhere. The other charge against Socrates was that he was kind of being a troublemaker, rabble rouser. He was always asking these critical questions about Athenian society, about its leadership. He did this through the young males who were going to be the next generation of leaders in Athens and whose parents were the current generation of leaders. He would engage them in these philosophical discussions about questions about virtue, about truth, about justice, and thereby indirectly critique Athenian society, Athenian conventions, Athenian leadership, Athenian views of virtue and justice, etc. And that might get somebody in trouble, sort of just as it is. But Socrates was doing this during the big war between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War that we'll read about with our Thucydides reading, Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. And is still the case today, right? It's viewed by many people as inappropriate and as damaging to be asking critical questions about the leadership of your nation during wartime. Right, that's the time when you want to be patriotic and support your leadership, etc. And as this war was raging between Athens and Sparta, Socrates was engaging in this critical discussion and debate. There was one moment that we'll read about too, where Socrates, during the war, and this is actually mentioned real briefly in the Apology, he stood up to support a number of admirals in the Athenian Navy who, after a big battle on the ocean with the Spartan Navy, had refused to pick up dead soldiers in the water and also probably some living soldiers, or we could call them sailors, I guess, because there was not any room for them in their boats. Their boats would have sunk if they had brought these people on board. But they had won the battle. And these admirals got back to Athens and thought they would be praised for what they did. Instead, they were criticized for not picking up the dead that were left in the water, and maybe some of the living as well, and were put on trial. Socrates was the only person who really came in defense of them. It's one of the few times we know he actually became kind of politically active. He talks a little bit about that in the Apology, right? That he believes that you can't be true to yourself and be a politician, right? That you have to tell people what they want to hear rather than what you really think. But this is one time he really stepped forward to defend these admirals and said, look, they did the right thing. They could not save these people. They could not bring these bodies on board in the situation that they were in and save the rest of their ships and their other sailors. The admirals were eventually condemned, but that was a time too where people could look back and say, well, Socrates was also mistaken there in his views about these admirals and what kind of treatment that they deserve. So these were some of the charges against Socrates by his accusers. There were three main accusers discussed in the Apology. And the Apology is obviously Socrates' defense. Notice the irony here that it's called the Apology. When we think about the word apology today, we often think of it referring to being apologetic about something, saying that you're sorry, right? Recanting, saying that, I made a mistake, I won't do it again, that sort of thing. Obviously, that's not what happens in the Apology of Plato when you read it. The word apology here is referring to another definition of the word apology, which is where you try and support and stand up for something that's been condemned or criticized. Right? We talk about somebody being an apologist for, let's say, an important figure who was put on trial or is viewed as not doing what they should have done, maybe arrested, maybe thrown out of office or something like that. Right? When we say so-and-so was an apologist for them, it means they stood up for them. They tried to support them. And that's what the word apology means in this dialogue. As we see, Socrates is not apologizing in the traditional sense, in the sense we often use the word today for what he did. He's standing up for himself and saying, I believe in what I was doing. I have been condemned, yes. There are people criticizing me for what I was doing, yes, but I believe in what I did. And that's how he essentially tries to defend himself here. A couple other quick things about Plato. He did found the first school that is anything like what we think of as a college or university today. It was called the Academy. And it was not as formal as higher education certainly today is. People could attend whatever lectures they chose to attend. They would often engage in discussion and debate sort of while walking around, which was actually the way Socrates would do his own sort of teaching in Athens, by walking around the city and again engaging people in discussion and debate. And Plato also had more of a casual approach to education, though he was doing it through this more formal kind of academy. And probably some of the Plato's dialogues were used in the academy, as some of his teaching tools. One of again Plato's most famous students was Aristotle. Aristotle also went on to form a school called the Lyceum that was even more formalized than Plato's academy. And most of the writings that we have that still exist from Aristotle, historians believe were actually from lecture notes that Aristotle used in his Lyceum. We will read some portions of those lecture notes that were put together in one of the editions of Aristotle's Ethics. We'll read 3 chapters from that. They're called 3 books, but they're essentially 3 chapters from that. So they do bring us the beginnings of formal education in Western culture, at least as we sort of understand it. There were some important differences between, I already mentioned some between Socrates and Plato, but also between Plato and Aristotle that I'll give you a preview of, and we'll talk about them a little more when we actually read Aristotle. I'm going to do a share screen here and show you sort of what is a famous picture of see if I can find it. Give me a second. A painting called The School of Athens. Let's see here. This is a painting by Raphael, well-known artist, and it's called The School of Athens. And the people portrayed here, certainly the people in the foreground, the people it's easier to sort of see them and maybe see what they're doing, are some of the most famous philosophers, mathematicians, etc., from ancient Greece. And the two people in the middle of the painting, you can see with the kind of standing right under the arch, are Plato and Aristotle. Plato is pointing up at the air, and you'll notice that Aristotle's sort of holding his hand down towards the ground. As I mentioned, Plato sort of always had his eye towards some kind of superior heavenly-like realm called the realm of the forms, typically, where these blueprints of perfection existed. And again, Plato believed that that's where we should have our attention. We should try to understand and be able to contemplate this world of perfection, try to understand it, and do what we could to kind of move society towards it. And there were forms for just about everything. Mundane forms like the form of a chair, right? That every chair that exists in the everyday natural world partakes of this ideal form of chairness. But there are also forms for things that would be more important, like justice, like the good, like virtue, etc. Aristotle was much more of an empiricist, much more focused on what seemed to be realistic, much more focused on human nature as he understood it. He was really almost an early scientist in that sense. In fact, when Aristotle the Great was out on his adventures, out on his conquest, he would supposedly send back to Aristotle in Athens examples of plant and animal life, because Aristotle put together one of the first category systems for plant and animal life that we have that exists, and is actually not dissimilar to the kind that we have in more modern day. And so Aristotle was always more interested in, what's possible? What are human beings possible? What is possible for human beings? What is human nature? What can we hope to achieve? And that was his method of trying to improve and enhance society. So he was much more grounded. People have traced historically the main difference between maybe the two main kinds of schools of thought in philosophy to Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle being viewed more as a realist, and again, more as kind of an early scientist, a proto-scientist, and Plato more as an idealist, Plato believing in the superiority of the world of ideas, or the realm of ideas. And it's been argued that every kind of philosophy since is more idealistic or more realistic, is more interested in the physical earthly world we live in, or is more interested in the realm of ideas and beliefs, etc. And it's sort of interesting that it's a teacher and student who developed these two very different philosophical traditions, the source of those traditions. Yes, Aristotle did take a lot of things from Plato, and we'll talk about those when we read Aristotle. But the fact that the two big traditions came from the way in which Aristotle moved away from Plato, I think is really important and again, really interesting. So we have Plato the idealist and Aristotle the realist, which again, we'll talk more about. Those are the main things that I wanted to talk about in terms of Plato's background and a little bit on the relationship between Plato and Aristotle. The next thing I wanted to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, is a dialogue called the Euthyphro that takes place, appears to take place right before the Apology, because again, it addresses some issues and raises some issues really that become more central when we get to Plato's Apology. So I'm going to show you here in a second, I'm going to share with you a picture that I think helps to show a little bit the what was going on in the Euthyphro. If I could find the correct image here. Okay, so Plato's Euthyphro. Plato's Euthyphro takes place right at the main entrance to the law courts. And Socrates is kind of walking around thinking a little bit about the charges against him, probably how he's going to defend himself, the questions about the fairness of the charges against him, those sorts of things. And he runs across Euthyphro, one of these young Athenian males. Euthyphro is at the law courts because his father actually had been put on trial. And Euthyphro is in fact one of his accusers. And this might seem odd. And so Socrates engages him in this discussion, and trying to understand what he's doing and why he's doing it. And Euthyphro is claiming that he's doing what he's doing because it's what is just. And it's also what he believes is the pious thing to do. Remember, pious is sort of loyal devotion. We saw different forms of piety in Sophocles' Antigone. And so he's there, he says, in the spirit of true piety, trying to be pious to, his religious duties, and to obeying the laws, etc. And so Socrates engages him in this discussion about, what is piety? And he uses this Socratic method that we'll talk about more specifically when we talk about the Apology, in this discussion with Euthyphro. And he asks him, what is piety? And Euthyphro gives all of these different answers about what piety is. He says it's what the gods love, and or it's what convention tells us we should be doing. And Socrates keeps saying, what do you really think piety is? Right? What makes somebody pious? And showing that Euthyphro's not really sure himself. He's just kind of parroting what he heard other people say, and he hasn't thought things through very clearly. And this is, again, one of the main kind of mechanisms of the mode of sort of inquiry that Socrates uses here. And what eventually comes out of this is that they fail to define piety. That's the way a lot of Plato's dialogues end. There's a question that's raised at the beginning: what is virtue? What is piety? What is justice? And they figured out some things that justice and piety, etc., are not. They haven't really determined what it is. Right? They've just knocked off a few possible candidates, and that's the way the dialogues tend to end. So the idea is, you're better off because you thought you knew something, and now you don't know, and some examples of what piety or justice, etc., are not, but you haven't figured out exactly what it is yet, but you're willing to keep thinking about it. That's what Socrates wants, right? Never stop thinking, never stop questioning. That's right, who Plato is as a person. That's what we find out in the Apology when he describes himself. But one of the major outcomes, however, of this sort of encounter with Euthyphro that's really important here is that Socrates kind of points out through his method of argument that whatever the good is, and they believe that it is this kind of universal thing, that there is this thing called the good, and it's true for everybody in all situations, in all cultures, at all times and places. It's a universal thing. And Socrates tries to argue that the good is the good, not because the gods claim that it's the good, but rather the gods claim it is the good because it is the good. Notice what he's doing there. He's placing the good and a way of trying to understand it through reason and rationality above the gods. This is one of the kinds of things that gets Socrates in trouble, right? He's starting to assert human reason, human rationality through things like his Socratic method as the key to the good life, as the key to understanding the nature of reality and of goodness and virtue, etc. Not by looking to what the gods say the good is or what virtue is, etc. He wants to take that more direct route through human reason and human rationality, through logic, the kind of logic, again, he uses in the Socratic method. So in a sense, he's saying that the good and virtue and all these ultimate universal things are superior to the gods. And even suggesting that we can't necessarily always trust the gods to know what those things are. Right? We need to kind of think about those things for ourselves. We should not just trust what people say, the gods say, or what the gods say, themselves, virtue or justice is. Nor should we just follow what convention says, right? Convention meaning what the laws say, or what most people say virtue is, or justice, or piety in this particular example, right? We need to really think about it for ourselves, right? And you can see in the little frieze portion here that was taken off one of the buildings that at least is supposed to portray, in this example, Socrates with Euthyphro, sort of this cartoonish in the bubbles there, Socrates saying, the point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or it's holy because it is beloved by the gods, right? And he ultimately wants to say that it's beloved by the gods because it is holy. In other words, it kind of pre-exists. It is what is guiding the gods, or should be guiding the gods at least. Not that the gods can just claim such and such as piety or such and such as holy. They don't have that power. The good, piety, these universals exist in some sense above and beyond the gods. So here we can kind of see one of the things that sort of gets Socrates in trouble here. He's starting to assert human reason, human rationality, logic, what he calls dialectic, the Socratic method, as being a better guide to the good life, a better guide potentially to making good laws, developing the best kind of society that we can have, making important decisions, like whether or not we should go to war with Sparta and how we should prosecute that war, which becomes a big issue, as we'll see when we discuss the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. Sparta was an oligarchy during the war. It had a few very powerful leaders who made all the decisions. It made decisions quickly. It stuck by them. Athens, for a large part of the war, was a democracy. And they would debate and discuss, for days and days, what their next move should be during the war. And it would take them a long time to make decisions. They would decide on one thing and then change their minds. There was a concern that these clever orators, these clever speakers, would be able to convince the people one way or another just based on their magnetism, right? The cult of personalities is sometimes called. What they should do, these generals might say, yes, we should go to war just because they want to make themselves famous, etc. And they were concerned, there were concerns that the common people were just too fickle, that they could just be pulled around by the nose by these clever speakers. And in fact, even though we know modern democracy, in some ways at least, even though it was a minimal democracy, was founded in Athens. Slaves couldn't participate. Women can participate, only citizens. Nonetheless, was a version of democracy. Plato and Aristotle were suspicious of it because they really were concerned about people being kind of pulled around by the nose by these very dynamic personalities these people who people wanted to look up to have kind of just their heroes, etc. And these people would only say what they said for their own self-aggrandizement, to be wealthy, to be powerful, to be famous, not because they really wanted to be good leaders and do the right thing. And again, we'll go back to that a little later when we talk about the Peloponnesian War. But this is the Euthyphro, and this is sort of why it's important for discussing the Apology. So now we'll kind of move on here to talk a little bit more specifically about the Apology, what we know as the trial of Socrates. And here is sort of an artist rendering of what Socrates' trial might have looked like. So we see him standing there before the people. Socrates is often described, and even self-described, as ugly. Sort of looks a little bit like a bulldog, really wide cheeks, a really large nose. And again, he even sometimes makes fun of himself. For example, when people would point out how ugly he is, he said that his nose was actually superior to other people's noses because he could take in more smells than other people could, and he would have ways of turning a criticism into a kind of a positive thing. So you see him here standing with his guard here, the soldiers, and here are the people who are going to decide his fate. Right? There was a group of people that would determine his fate. In the background there to the left, you can see what's called the Acropolis, the outcropping of rocks that held some of the other main government buildings in the Parthenon, as it was known, which we'll talk a little more about in the future. And so this is, again, is an artist rendering of the Apology. One of the interesting things here is that the Apology is the only of Plato's dialogues that we know Plato himself attended this event, and it actually really did occur. Because Plato mentions himself. You may have noticed that when you were reading it, when Socrates talks about the people that were there, especially the people that were some of his students. He mentions them, and he mentions that the brother of Plato is there. So we know that Plato himself attended this. One of the things that should make us think, as we should with all the dialogues really, is what does Plato want us to think of his teacher, right? Historians believe that certainly probably some of what Plato portrays here is really Socrates' actual defense and how he tried to defend himself, what he said, etc. And it's certainly consistent with what else we know about Socrates. We're not sure about the other dialogues. We don't know if Plato actually attended some of the debates and discussions that are portrayed in the other dialogues. We know that some of them definitely he probably was not present at. The next one we'll read, the Crito, we're pretty sure he wasn't present for that. So they're probably largely fictionalized. They may be about events that Plato heard about, where Socrates, debated somebody, and then he decided to write about it, or they may have been fictionalized completely by Plato. But Socrates is consistent enough in the dialogues that it's generally believed that he was trying to, portray Socrates in a particular way, and probably being relatively truthful to who Socrates was. Nonetheless, Socrates was a human being. He was fallible. He had his weaknesses. He had his failings, like everybody does. And there are clearly times when Plato portrays Socrates as kind of a bully, as somebody who's not necessarily being 100% honest, truthful all the time. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And some other times in which he's not necessarily put in a flattering light, right? Probably some of that were actually Socrates' failings, but again, we don't know the extent to which things are also fictionalized. But we should think about, what does Plato want us to think about Socrates? Clearly, he believes he was a great teacher. Clearly, he wrote the dialogues in part as thanks to his teacher, right, for being this important figure and for what he taught him, for what he did for the people of Athens, etc. Um, and so he's going to portray him generally in a positive way. But I think that's one of the questions we should ask ourselves. You know, after you read the Apology and the Crito, what do you think Plato wants us to think about Socrates? So again, here's a portrayal of Socrates sort of at his trial. And again, you'll notice that really, even though it's suggested that he was given the chance to repent for what he was doing, to say, I will stop going around Athens and engaging these young, Athenian males who are the next generation of leaders in debates and discussions about these important topics in a way, especially not do it in a way that seems to be a criticism of Athens' leadership. And it's sort of suggested that had he done this, he probably could have gotten off with a minor punishment, not been forced to drink hemlock, and which was terribly poisonous. It was a horrible kind of death. It would eat you out from the inside, terribly painful. But that maybe he would have just gotten a short jail term or something like that. There actually are, they actually found what they think is the prison in Athens where Socrates was held, and actually potentially even the prison cell that Socrates was held in, and also lots of examples of the small clay cups that you would drink the hemlock out of. They're very small because you didn't have to drink much of it for it to be lethal. So Socrates, maybe his life could have been saved had he said, I'll stop doing what I'm doing, etc. Or maybe if he had agreed to go and live elsewhere, that maybe he could have, been saved. But no, he believed that what he was doing was the right thing to do. And even you'll probably notice in some places he becomes a little arrogant and even kind of suggests that Athens should be thankful to him for what he did, and that it will rue the day that it put him to death, if indeed that is the verdict. And we find out 2/3 of the way through the dialogue that indeed was the verdict. It certainly wasn't 100% verdict against him. He did have his supporters there, as we know, his students were there. But nonetheless, he was ultimately condemned to death. There's a famous painting of Socrates with some of his students, and probably what was kind of being portrayed here is the end of his life. These are no doubt his students that he's surrounded with. And you see them, how distraught they are. You'll see the way Socrates is chained to this bed. And I guess what we're supposed to think is the prison cell. Now, this is an artist rendering, and it's no doubt not exactly the way things looked. That doesn't look a whole lot like a prison cell necessarily. But Socrates is telling them that they should not feel bad at his death. They should carry on his teachings. He's dying because he believes in what he was doing. He's dying with his boots on, as they say. You'll see he's being handed the poison. The actual small cups he drank the poison out of don't look anything like that sort of wooden chalice there, if that's, I don't know, wood or clay. Again, they were much smaller, but that's the artist's portrayal here. Well, you can see how distraught his students are. You'll also notice that while some of the students are young or look young, that some of them actually look very old as well. Crito, whose namesake is the dialogue we'll read for next week, was maybe one of his oldest students, if not his oldest students, almost the same age as Socrates himself. Maybe the gentleman on the left there in the gray robe that looks older is supposed to be Crito. I'm not sure exactly what the artist was trying to show here in terms of whether or not these are specific people. But, he's again telling them not to feel sorry for him, maybe to feel sorry for Athens for making this big mistake and putting him to death, but that again, he's dying for what he believed in. And I think he definitely believes he's going to be a martyr and wants to be a martyr, maybe to an extent, right? Just like Antigone did, wants to be somebody who died for a cause, for beliefs that he thinks are really important, and to be remembered, right, for dying for these important beliefs that he held. So I talked a little bit about the charges against Socrates. He says several times that he is not going to do evil. He actually claims that, saying that he will stop doing what he's doing, apologizing in again, the modern sense, asking for forgiveness, that would be an evil thing. What he means by that is he would not be portraying himself as he genuinely is. He would be falsifying himself. And that is a kind of evil. That is a kind of immoral, highly immoral thing for Socrates, to try to portray himself as somebody different than who he really is. And again, that he is going to be himself. He's not going to change that. And so again, we're seeing Socrates at, in maybe some ways, the most kind of stressful moment as his life, in his life, following through on what he believes and being himself, to the end. And talking about the charges against him, he at several points engages people in one of these Socratic kind of dialectical episodes, the Socratic methods, I called it. And I just want to talk a little bit about more specifically what that actually is, because it's very important. There are versions of this that we still use today and the teachers still use today of the Socratic method. It's actually a teaching method that has actually become popular in the last 10 years or so. The Socratic circle, or there are other kind of terms for it. And as it describes here, the question and answer method of philosophizing, or dialectic. Dialectic means sort of a back and forth, right, of ideas, exchange of ideas. You can see how it shares the same root as the word dialogue, right, of a back and forth. The most formalized version of dialectic is what we understand typically as, we talk about thesis, right? So there's an idea, a thesis that somebody might state, or promote, or present, assert. Then there's the antithesis, the antithesis, which is the opposite. And hopefully, if there's something good in both of those, you can find a way to combine them into a synthesis, right? So you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The idea being that that's a way to move your ideas forward. That's a way to at least start approaching the truth. And so you believe then that after you've achieved a synthesis of this initial idea and its opposite, that synthesis then becomes the new thesis, and then there's an antithesis, and the process moves forward. You see this in a lot of idealistic kind of philosophy, way beyond hundreds of years after Socrates and Plato. The philosopher Hegel, a German philosopher I'll mention a few times during the semester, is most famous for kind of formalizing this kind of dialectical sort of movement. So it can take place in terms of a live debate and discussion, as we see with Socrates, or that dialectic can be something somebody can even engage in by themselves intellectually, right? You can present an idea to yourself, you can mull it over, you can think about it, consider what might be an opposite or what might be an alternate to that idea, see if you can find a way of bringing them together, right? Making them so they can be synthesized into something better, etc. So it can be both an interior intellectual process and live discussion, live debate, right? But it is this kind of question, answer, back and forth. As it says, used by Socrates and Plato in his early dialogues in particular, like the Euthyphro, as I mentioned, often in conjunction with pretended ignorance This is important. Socratic irony, whereby a self-professed expert's overconfident claim to knowledge is subverted. So the basic idea here is that, as we see with Socrates, he will draw somebody out so they claim to know something, what piety is in the case of Euthyphro, or what justice is, right? What virtue is. Some of these kind of really important ideas in ancient Athens, especially in thinking about making good laws and trying to make this democracy work, for example. And he would draw them out and get them to claim that they knew what virtue is or what justice is. And typically he would show them that they didn't know what they were talking about. Right? He would kind of reduce them to sort of admitting their ignorance. And show them they didn't know what they were talking about. Typically because they were parroting the beliefs of somebody else. Sometimes those other people were these professional teachers called sophists that I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk more about. Or that they were just following convention, or again, what somebody else told them. And through this sort of yes or no, very binary kind of questioning that Socrates would use, he reduces them to complexity to the point that they ultimately basically say, I don't know, you tell me. Right? Socrates believes, and I think Plato did as well, that you're actually in a better state when you're willing to admit you don't know what you're talking about than when you are confidently asserting something that was false or that you hadn't really thought about. And that once you recognize your ignorance, that you will admit to it, and that you're in a better place then to actually restart the inquiry than you were when you were done thinking about it because you thought you already knew what virtue or justice or piety is. One way Socrates would draw people out into these discussions is through what's called the pretended ignorance here, Socratic irony. So Socrates would say, look, I don't know what virtue is, or I'm not sure what justice is. And that would make the other person assert and say, well, I know what it is. It's X, or that so-and-so taught me that here's what virtue is, or that our laws tell us that such and such is what virtue is or what justice is. But Socrates would presume sort of ignorance here, and you get the idea that it was often a pretended kind of ignorance. Though it also is genuine in a sense here. It's not fully pretended. Because Socrates and Plato were both always willing to recognize that they could be wrong, which is why you always need to keep thinking. Knowledge is not something you just acquire as a possession and put up on a shelf somewhere. You need to continually ask yourself questions, right? The self-examined life, a life that doesn't involve self-examination is not worth living, right? Every life that is worth living involves self-examination. We still talk about that idea today, right? So again, this is a way of trying to pursue the truth, though you don't necessarily sort of achieve it in the end. There are lots of different terms for this Socratic method. Sometimes it is called destructive sort of examination. The forensic method is sometimes called, right? If we think about the way in which, for example, we use clues to try to answer questions by looking for evidence. We still use a version of this today in our law courts. Right? This is some of the contemporary relevance of this. In our law courts, we believe, right, that there is a truth. Somebody either did or did not murder somebody else. And for us to put somebody on trial and to either punish them or free them, we have to believe that there is a truth out there that we can discover. Right? Um, so we used this, a similar kind of binary mode of question and answer to try and narrow things down and kind of figure out what the truth is, right? And just as Socrates will use these yes or no questions, right? He'll force people to answer yes or no in a way that suggests that there is kind of a black and white answer to the question, because that will allow them to potentially, find a final resolution to whatever the issue is they're thinking about. Now, for Socrates, there never is this final solution. In our law courts, we hope we find that final solution, right? The person is either guilty or not guilty. We have discovered the truth. Just as Socrates' interlocutors, the people he's debating and discussing with, like Euthyphro, become often very frustrated that he makes them give yes or no answers. Right? That still happens today. You know, when you watch television shows and movies about when somebody's on the stand being questioned, they sometimes become frustrated when they're asked questions where they have to give a yes or no answer, right? And they'll sometimes start giving a more detailed answer, and the person questioning them will say no, yes or no, and the judge might be forced them to give a yes or no answer, but they might want to say, well, there's more to it than that question suggests, right? But again, sometimes forced to give a yes or no answer, and they become very frustrated at that. If you think about it, every question assumes something. There are presumptions behind every question, right? Is that things are either black or white, right? That there is no gray area. We know that in life there actually is gray area, right? In fact, we try to address that, I would say, in the way we deal with the law today, by having, for example, there are different degrees in which you could murder somebody, right? And there's manslaughter if somebody's doing something in self-defense, etc. And also when we sentence something, right, we give them a harsher or less harsh sentence because we're trying to take the particulars of the situation into account. That's the gray area, right? So we do try to acknowledge the gray area, but we also, at a very basic level, we're trying to discover the truth. And to discover the truth, you can't have gray area involved, really, right? It has to be yes or no, black and white, which is why we still use the Socratic method of question and answer, where people are often forced to give yes or no answers, right? But again, somebody might question a question that they're given, right? That it's possible to give a yes or no answer to something, right? If somebody says, do you believe virtue is either A or B? Maybe you believe virtue is C, but you're forced to say that it's A or B, right? You can become very frustrated. The Socratic method can be very controlling. That's an important lesson here, right? And it's an important lesson for teachers, right? And you as students have probably been in situations where you feel like you're supposed to be having an open discussion about something, but you feel like the discussion is being controlled by maybe one of the participants or maybe the teacher or professor in the situation, because of the way the questions are being asked. Forces you to give certain kinds of responses. And sometimes you don't even want to participate, because in participating, you are justifying, or it's in a sense saying yes to a part of a question you're being asked that you don't think is true, right? So that's really important here, how controlling this method could be. Sometimes Socrates uses it in a way that's very controlling in some of the dialogues. Sometimes not as much. Sometimes you get the sense that it is sort of kind of a genuine search for the truth, as it says here, disinterestedly pursuing the truth. But much of the time, it seems like Socrates, he might be claiming ignorance about what virtue is or what justice is, but he definitely knows what they're not. because he's thought through it before, right? So that allows him to kind of steer the discussion in a certain direction to sort of show you, if you think it's something that he really believes it's not, if you believe justice is doing good things to your friends and harming your enemies, he's going to show you where you're wrong, right? So he might be ignorant about what justice actually is, but he in many instances is sure that what many people think it is, it's not, and he's going to point that out to you. So, you know, there's again a lot of gray area in the Socratic method itself. Yes, he seems to be ignorant and claims ignorance to draw somebody out, but he's not. Typically, you can tell he does have some idea of what it is, or at least knows what it's not, whatever topic they're discussing. And there is, in a sense, which he sort of generally seems to want them to keep pursuing the truth, that he doesn't necessarily know 100% what virtue is or what justice is, etc. There were people, as I mentioned, called sophists, who did seem to think they believed and knew what everything really was, or many things were, in a way that would really concern Socrates and Plato, I would say, as well. And they were the people that are called the sophists. I mentioned that they were the first professional teachers in ancient Greece. Many of them would take payment for what they provided, though not always. They obviously believed that they did know some important things, because they professed to be teachers, they professed to be knowledgeable, they professed to know things. And many times, the same students that Socrates had, these young Athenian males, would be the same students the sophists would have. And sometimes some of Socrates' students also, you know, went to the sophists, and Socrates would talk to them sometimes, and also sometimes criticizes them. If they were having a discussion and one of his students mentioned that, let's say, justice is something, and he knew they got that from a sophist, he'd say, "You got that from a sophist, didn't you? This is not your own belief necessarily," right? So the sophists and Socrates in some ways competed for students, the same students. But you had to be wealthy in many instances to go to a sophist because you had to pay them. The sophist method of teaching was very different than Socrates. You'll notice in many places Socrates will actually claim that he's not a teacher, and that will seem odd. He's known as one of the great teachers in the history of Western philosophy. What I think basically he's saying there, or Plato is saying there through Socrates, is that Socrates is not somebody who goes around professing to know things, and that believing knowledge is something that he can give you, or wisdom is something he can give you, like a possession, right, that one person can hand to another person. If that's what teaching is, Socrates wants nothing to do with that. Teaching for him is getting people to learn to think for themselves. And at times to engage in these discussions with other people to search for the truth. The sophists, on the other hand, never profess ignorance the way Socrates does, right? Who's going to pay to go to them as teachers if they say they don't know what they're talking about, or they're not sure of something, right? As it shows here, the Greek word sophos or sophia had the meaning wise or wisdom since the time of the poet Homer. That's a common name, Sophia, right? And originally connoted anyone with expertise in a specific domain of knowledge or craft. So these sophists are claiming to have wisdom and to be able to be teachers for people. Their teaching method was very different again from Socrates. Socrates would engage in live, open debate discussion. He never claimed to know the truth. Sophists, on the other hand, would often try to get people to believe what they believed, to try and teach them in the way they tried to teach, by telling stories. They often used poetry. Their main device or tool was what was called rhetoric. As it says here, the sophists were a group of teachers of philosophy and rhetoric. Rhetoric, in this case, means, persuasive speech. We think of rhetoric in either writing or in speaking, right? And we often use it in a pejorative sense, right? Somebody's just using rhetoric, right? They're just using a bunch of words to get you to believe something, but it's not really the truth. Or they just want you to believe what they believe so that you'll follow them, right? Think about presidential debates and et cetera, and speeches, and whether or not those are rhetoric, right? Are the people actually saying what's true, or that do they say what they really believe, or they just want you to support them, right? So it often has a negative connotation. But rhetoric can also be viewed just as a general tool of persuasive speech that you can use to try to persuade people of something that is the truth, right? To try to actually help people, just as you can use it to try and control people's thinking, right? But their method was very different in the way they often used this kind of persuasive speech and rhetoric, the examples that they would use. And so their method of teaching was very different than Socrates. You can see in some of Socrates' dialogues the difference. When Socrates is controlling debate, I mean, if you look at our text for the Apology, you can actually see this in some instances. When Socrates is controlling the discussion, because you'll see these question and answer going on page 13 in our version of the Apology, is the beginning of this Socratic method with Miletus as the person he's debating with. And you can see it's this question and answer, right? You can actually visually tell Socrates is in control here. When Socrates is debating things with sophists, you get something much different. The sophist will go on for a whole paragraph at a time and trying to explain something using poetry, or saying Homer says this, or some other wise person says this, and try and use their persuasive speech. Right? You can see why these young Athenian males who want to be the next generation of leaders would go to the sophist, because persuasive speech, rhetoric, was a tool for them, right? To get people to support them, to be the next generation of leaders. So there's this competition going on between Socrates and the sophists that is important backstory that is part of what's going on here with Socrates in the Apology and Socrates' accusers in the Apology. Is this inner story, this inner debate, this inner contest between Socrates and these sophists. So, we might ask, what are some of the things that Socrates tries to say in his defense? Again, he says he believes in what he's doing, that it's important. When he sometimes does say he has nothing to teach, it means he's not a sophist. He doesn't profess to know a lot of things that he's going to tell people that he's a very great, knowledgeable person. There's a scene here that's really important where the Oracle of Delphi is evoked. You might remember, have some knowledge of what oracles are, right? They're these, an oracle is a source of knowledge and wisdom. You see versions of oracles in lots of different traditions. And an oracle is sort of a place you go. It involves mystery. It involves this kind of otherworldly voice that can answer questions you might have. And sometimes the questions that people would go to this oracle at Delphi, which still exists, you see a photo of it here in the mountains in Greece. Sometimes they would journey to the oracle for very simple questions. What kind of dress should I wear for the big date, right? Or questions about their business, or something very simple. Sometimes they were really important questions, when Athens was invaded by Sparta and they thought they were going to be overwhelmed. They went to the oracle to say, how do we defend ourselves? Right? And there was a priestess, typically, as the way it's described, that would work at this oracle, who could hear what the oracle was saying and would write down a response for you. And there was a big clay pot, and you would write your question on this little piece of clay and put it in the pot. The priestess would read it and tell the oracle and get an answer from the oracle and give you the answer. They still have some of these pieces of clay that have these questions on them. That's how they know some of the questions were really mundane and some of the questions were really weighty, very important kinds of things. This oracle at Delphi supposedly said that Socrates was the most wise person in all of Greece. Socrates' accusers wanted to use this against him by saying, look, this oracle said that you're the wisest person, so you're going around trying to flaunt that wisdom and knowledge that you have and being this critical questioner, etc. And again, trying to kind of use that against him. Socrates' response to this is very interesting. He basically says, when I heard this, the oracle say this, I went around Athens and I thought, look, there's got to be somebody who's more knowledgeable and wiser than I am. And he talks about the way he went around and talked to all kinds of people from all walks of life, craftsmen and politicians and everybody in between. And in fact, could not find somebody who really seemed to be wise and knowledgeable to him. And not more knowledgeable than him. But he said, look, if I'm the wisest person in Greece, it's because I admit my ignorance. These other people don't. They all claim to have knowledge and wisdom. When you really kind of question them about it, you find that they don't know everything they think they know. Right? They think they know everything about what it is to be a playwright or a musician or a politician, or something else, a general in the army. When they don't know as much as they think they know, they're not willing to profess their ignorance, whereas he is. So he's trying to turn that sort of toward his advantage here. There's still a kind of arrogance in saying, yes, maybe I am the wisest person in Greece because I admit what I don't know and nobody else does. But by the same token, he is saying, look, I'm professing my ignorance. I'm not claiming to be giving people answers to all these big questions, and questions involved in things like how they should live their lives and how we should prosecute this war against Sparta, etc. So again, by the same token, he's using this disavowal of knowledge, as it's called, kind of to his advantage here. He talks about other things he's not willing to do in his defense. He's not willing to parade his wife and children in front of the law, in front of the judges and say, look at my poor family, what's going to happen to my children, what's going to happen to my wife if you put me to death, etc. Because he's not going to play on the emotions of the court. To him, that was not a virtuous thing to do. And he pointed out that other people had done it before, and it was common. But he said, look, this is not something I'm going to do. You'll notice after he's condemned to death, the last thing he says is, those of you who are my supporters, those of you who are my students, please do to my children what I have done to you. Ask them critical questions. Make them stop and think. Right? Don't let them develop a kind of arrogance, what was sometimes called the conceit of knowledge, right? We talk about somebody who's really conceited about something, really arrogant. Don't let them develop the conceit of knowledge, thinking they know everything or know all they need to know, etc. Question them, just like I questioned you, right? So again, he's sort of being himself until the very end. One of the things he says, interestingly, in his defense, after he says, I believe in what I'm doing, it's the right thing, is he says, look, if I was doing such a bad job here and I was actually injuring people, some of my students would be testifying against me. None of them are. That comes across, I think, and I think Plato wanted us to believe that that was a pretty strong part of Socrates' defense, right? That none of his students would be willing to come forth and say, you harmed me. I should have gone to a sophist instead of you, right? Or regret that they had gone to Socrates as, again, a kind of teacher. You might think, on the other hand, that maybe Socrates had done such a good job in winning them over, right, that they couldn't see the damage he had done to them. But Plato certainly, I think, wants us to believe that they didn't, none of them were his accusers because they really believed they were better off for having been his students. So he sort of says that in his defense, I think, which is, which is important here. There are a few other things he says in his defense, but basically he says, I believe I was brought here. He says, I believe that it's the gods who have put me in this position. Again, one of his charges against him was he didn't believe in the gods. He says he believes in essentially what are called demigods, which are half human, half god. Or kind of the lower gods as they're described. We'll talk about those in some of our other readings. And so he basically says, look, if I believe in these lower gods, I have to believe in the higher gods as well, because demigods can't exist without these higher gods. And that's sort of his way of dealing with this question of whether or not he's a religious person or an atheist, because he does seem to have used human reason to challenge the authority of the gods. But he does say at one point, I believe that I was put here on the earth to be a critical questioner. He talks about being a gadfly. A gadfly is these flies that would sting animals, bite them, and it would hurt. They would respond to it. And he said he believed that his job, his role that he was destined to hold, is to be a gadfly in Athens, to wake people from their stupor, from the stupor of their conceit, from the stupor of thinking that they didn't need to examine their own lives or examine their own laws, right? That they needed to be awakened intellectually, and that was really his job, in being a gadfly. And this is part of, when he's basically saying that you'll feel sorry in the long run for putting me to death, because what I'm actually doing here is a service, and when I'm gone, you'll miss that. Now, we know his students, Plato, Aristotle, and his lesser known students did carry on his legacy. And in fact, Athens was in such bad shape after the Peloponnesian War, they were no longer a military power, and they were no longer a real colonial power again. And they started turning more towards philosophy and the arts, and it became what they were known for. They turned their creative energies towards intellect and the arts and culture, and got away from their colonial past and their military past. And again, we'll talk about this when we talk about the Peloponnesian War. The last thing I want to mention here is one of the other things Socrates says before he's put to death about his future, what he thinks his punishment should be. And you may have noticed that he says that he thinks he deserves to be thanked for what he did. He needs to be treated well for what he did. And of course, you would never do this to somebody you're putting to death. He mentions specifically in the translation that we had maintenance in the Prytaneum. Now, the Prytaneum was a place that they would celebrate people who had done great things, Olympic heroes, generals who had done, great things, people that, they were, to really look up to, almost kind of a country club, if you will, for the great heroes. And Olympic heroes as well as great leaders, great generals, etc. So here he's being cheeky at the end here, saying that, not only will you rue the day that you put me to death, because what I was actually doing was good for you, and you don't realize it yet. Though those people who were my students realize it. You should be celebrating who I was and what I did. So this picture here is actually, now Prytaneum means a public building. So there were lots of kinds of public buildings called the Prytaneum. This is just one example here, that they've done some rebuilding on the central column, so you can see kind of what it looked like here. But this is one of the buildings known as a Prytaneum. It's the kind of place that Socrates is mentioning here, that he thinks that should be his punishment. Instead of being put to death, maintenance in the Prytaneum means he could go and live there and have all his meals given to him and all of his clothes, have all his needs taken care of, and that should be his, their response, their quote-unquote punishment of him for what he did. So again, to the very end, being himself, supporting what he did, defending what he did, claiming that what he did was for the best of the Athenian people, etc. So I know this was a really long lecture because I did a lot of beginning discussion of Plato and Aristotle and talked about the Euthyphro. The lecture I'll do on Crito for next week will be shorter because we've already dealt with some of this background information. But this is the Apology lecture with, again, some of that background. As always, send me an email if you have questions about anything. I hope you find this helpful. In the Crito, I'll just give you a quick preview here. Crito is one of, as I've already mentioned, Socrates' oldest students. He comes to Socrates when Socrates is in prison, shortly before he's to be put to death, and offers to break Socrates out of jail. He and some of other of Socrates' students have put their resources together and figured out a way to break him out of jail. And Crito tries to convince him that they should let him break him out of jail. You can probably guess how Socrates is going to respond. No, that's not a virtuous thing to do. How would it look if I, allowed you to do this? So the main part of the dialogue is Crito trying to convince Socrates to do something that's very unsocratic. And it shows you how much students of Socrates like Crito loved and cared for him because they were willing to do this very unsocratic thing to save his life. And this is where we can kind of speculate a little bit about what Plato's motives were here and how he portrays Plato. So you'll see the Socratic method here between Socrates and Crito, and between Socrates and an imaginary dialogue he has with the laws of Athens. It's the only time he actually has a dialogue with something like the laws, with this sort of aggregate, non-human sort of thing. But it's fascinating the way he does it. So that's what you will see with the Crito. So you'll be reading that for early next week, and I'll be posting my lecture. So again, let me know if you have questions about anything. Have a good weekend, and hope you found this helpful, and I will see you next time.